First of all, thank you for asking us to come and talk to you today. We're very passionate about this, so we're delighted to be able to share things with you. As Olaf said, we're going to be talking about the application of culture segments today, so I've just got 5 broad considerations to talk to you about. And then my colleague Joss Luckin here is going to talk to you even more practically about copywriting and how we write for these segments, so more detailed strategies for how we engage with people. So I'm going to talk about 5 things. One is about knowing your whole market and understanding your market. The second is how you connect it to your brand. The third is how we program for the segments. The fourth is how you differentiate your communications, and the fifth is about measuring the impact. So, Morris Hargreaves McIntyre, we are an international consultancy, so we have offices in the UK, in Australia, New Zealand. We work extensively in Scandinavia, including Norway, and also in the United States, plus some other places along the way. We have 50 members of staff, and we've been operating for about 25 years. Some of you have met my colleagues, Andrew McIntyre, so I'm the middle one of the Morris Hargreaves McIntyre, and I've already introduced Joss Luckin. So culture segments, which is what we're talking to you about today, for us, segmentation is about deep-seated motivations and values. So culture segments is a psychographically based segmentation system. I know many of you have had introductions about culture segments before, so we're not going to talk in detail about the individual segments. There's plenty of information on our website about that, and Audiences Norway have plenty of information about it for you too. But the basic principle is that people have deep-seated values which determine what type of culture they engage with. So culture segments and a psychographic approach builds on previous approaches to segmentation, but we think although the other factors still matter, they're important. They're not what drives engagement in culture. So demographics, not all age groups think the same. I'm 55 years of age. Not every 55-year-old has the same values, wants to engage in the same culture for the same reasons. Behaviour, so what art forms people have engaged in, again, is an indicator that they might re-engage, but not always. We know there are plenty of people who have a desire to engage with other forms of culture that they haven't yet done so. And attitudes has informed previous segmentation systems, but again, we know that people change their attitudes, they sometimes lie about them, or they sometimes misremember them. Social desirability also comes into play in terms of people's attitudes. The link here, if you haven't already segmented yourself, please do so. I think it's in 15 languages, Joss? Yes. On the website, including Norwegian. So we're going to talk about understanding your whole market. So it's very helpful to have data which tells you what your market looks like. So we have developed Audience Atlas to this end, and Audience Atlas Norway took place back in 2013 now, and sampled 1,500 adults living in Oslo and Akershus, because that was believed to be broadly representative of the whole market, and then the data was weighted to be representative of the population across the country. Other population studies do exist. I think some data was referred to in one of the presentations earlier, and there's plenty of information via Audiences Norway about audiences. What Audience Atlas does, it looks at not only people's current propensity to engage, both in individual forms of culture and with individual organisations, but also their potential to engage, which is what makes it so valuable. So we divide the market in 5 ways. So we have recent visitors. So those are people who, in this context, have visited in the last 3 years. We have lapsed visitors. So I'm just switching between those because what's coming up on my screen, I'm one ahead on the screen. We have lapsed visitors, so people who visited more than 3 years ago. We have potential visitors, so these are people who have never visited but are interested, and in our experience, we also call these people open to persuasion. In our experience, this is very often the largest segment of people, and where a lot of audience development effort should be based. And then we have people who are not in the market. So these are people who have may have heard of you, but they've never been, and they don't want to go. Sometimes I think in cultural organisations, particularly when we're funded by the state, you know, we're often funded to include everybody, but the reality of life is that not everybody wants to engage in a particular art form. I love contemporary dance, I'm not a huge fan of ballet. So, you know, there are things for each of us that drives engagement or not. So some people are just not going to be in our market. It's not to say that some people can't change their mind. We did some very interesting work for an orchestra where someone had become a very late convert to orchestral music because he bought a car and the car radio was tuned to classic FM. And it took him a while to work out how to change the radio, and in that short period of time he became a true convert. So it's not to say that people who weren't in the market can't suddenly become part of the market. And then we have people who are simply not aware of us, and it's quite surprising often how large this segment can be. So this is an issue about our communications, possibly, or about our messages not resonating with people. So we have... So we have 5 broad strategies for, I'll put all these up at the same point, for these different frequencies with which people engage. So if you are a recent attender, then our objective is to deepen our relationships with those people, either possibly to get them to come more frequently or to engage more deeply with what we offer. If you're a lapsed attender, then our strategy is to reactivate those people. Obviously not everyone who's lapsed will be wanting to be reactivated, so we're doing quite a bit of work with zoos at the moment in the UK and in Australia, and the zoos have a very large family market, so at some point some of those people, they do continue to attend as adults, but a huge amount don't. You know, they maybe go back as grandparents when they have younger children to take. So we have to understand the proportion of our market that might be open to being reactivated. If you're a potential attender or this open to persuasion, you have a level of interest, our strategy is to acquire those people, so we have to think about our programming, our communications, for how we might encourage those people to engage with us. If you're not in the market, as I said, some just won't come, but some, it's a question of repositioning, and I've got an example for you a bit later on about that. And then if you're not aware, and you're active culturally and we think you might be in the market, then we have to raise our profile with you, either through just making sure the messages reach you or making sure we've got the right messages for the right people. So culture segments helps us do this. So what culture segments does is segment the market into groups of people with shared needs, not necessarily shared demographics. There are some demographics that underlie culture segments, you know, so some segments you're more likely to find older people or younger people, but different age groups spread across all of them, different ethnicities spread across all of them, so it's not driven by demographics. It's a correlation, but it's not what causes attendance. So we won't go into detail of culture segments today, but we'll talk about how we apply them. Sorry, I'm going to use the adapter here. So we have 8 broad segments, which you have seen before, so I won't go into details on these now, but I'll refer to them as we go along. And we have to think about the different strategies that we pair with each segment. So when you look at recent visitors, you will see that we have different proportions of people in each of the segments. And when you look at the lapsed segments, you'll see that for some of them, so Essence, the purple one on the left, and for stimulation, we have the orange one, we have almost twice as many lapsed visitors as we have recent. So that's important for us to think about the strategies that we will use to develop those audiences. We then move on to the potential audiences. And as you can see, again here, we have significant proportions of potential audiences. So for affirmation, which is the purple column, the third along, you can see that we have more potential audiences than we do recent audiences. So there are more people in the market who are open to engaging than are currently engaging. I should have said this is for a Scandinavian museum, so I'm not telling you which one it is, but this is a museum audience. So we have more people who are likely to engage with us than are currently engaging. And then we move on to the people who are not aware in the market. And as you can see, we have significant numbers of people who are not aware of us. If you look at the yellow column, which is expression, they're very large numbers. So 109,000 people who are not aware of this museum compared to the 84,000 who would describe themselves as recent visitors. So more people unaware than those who have been. But the museum is successful at attracting expression. It's its largest market, the yellow one, but you can see there's still enormous numbers in both the potential and the not yet aware audience. So this is what we have to do, is raise awareness here with these people. So for the potential audiences, they're already open to the idea, and we have to get the right message. For those who are not aware, we simply have to raise awareness. So it's back to this point of different strategies depending on people's historic frequency and relationship with us. If you look here in the release market, we have 33,000 people who are on the recent, but again, we have a very large lapsed market, as does Essence over on the left. So this means there's a retention problem here. Why have these people lapsed? As I said, some people may have been and decided it's not for them, so they've naturally lapsed. But for many people, it's about giving them a reason to return. And that's where we have to start understanding the different segments. So an Essence audience will have a different reason to return than a stimulation segment would be, for example. So Essence, as a segment, are fiercely independent. Significant numbers of people who work in the cultural sector, like ourselves, are of the Essence segment. We pride ourselves, that includes me, we pride ourselves on being fiercely independent. We almost make a virtue of not being influenced. We hate being marketed to. Given that's our job, it's interesting. So we hate being marketed to. We're looking at the programme, we're looking for the quality of the programme. We will make our own minds up. So marketing is not really going to influence us. We want to be informed. We want to find out what's on, but we're not necessarily going to be influenced. So for us, the venue needs to look at programming. Is there something unique and new, something prestigious that's going to attract us to attend? If we think about release, they're looking for some big unmissable event, you know, a must-see, must-do type of thing to attend. So we have to understand the different motivations and the different needs for the different segments. So the other important thing about applying culture segments, although it starts with thinking about who your market is, it's actually applicable across the whole organisation. So many of the organisations we're working with are using it to inform their programming. They're using it to inform membership, to attract volunteers, to increase fundraising, to inform the whole visitor service experience. So the valuable thing about culture segments is that you can apply it across your whole organisation. It's not simply something that the marketing department uses. And we're going to give you some examples of how it's being used in this session now. So the second thing I'd like to talk about is how you connect culture segments to your brand. Sorry, I'm struggling here. I have 5 times I've worked out you have to click. So Shakespeare's Globe, which many of you will know about, it's a recreation of Shakespeare's original theatre on Bankside in London. It's an iconic theatre, reconstructed on the actual site where Shakespeare's Globe was, and reconstructed to be an identical reconstruction of the original theatre. About 3 years ago, the Globe came to the realisation that they actually knew very little about their audience. It's presumed by many of us working in the sector that it's a major heritage attraction for tourists. So it's as much a heritage venue as it is a theatre, and that was certainly my perception until we started working with them. So they wanted to take a look at who their markets were, who their audiences were. So we started work with them about 3 years ago on a major audience and visitor insight project to understand the different audiences and their connections with the venue and the brand. And ultimately, just last year, it resulted in a rebranding strategy, which was extremely interesting to help them re-engage visitors. Okay, it is fine. What we found out was that they had a very siloed approach to their brand. So there's Globe Theatre, the performances, there's Globe Education, and there was Globe Exhibition and Touring. They have an exhibition about Shakespeare's life. in the venue, and they also go on tour. But it was operating in a siloed way, almost as three separate entities. They had their own teams, brands, logos. There wasn't a shared sense of what the Globe was about, a shared sense of its cause. So we undertook some audience research, which involved a really detailed analysis of their bookers and a survey of their bookers and visitors in the venue. We analysed our own audience atlas data for the UK and for London, and we held an audience forum, which is where you get very large numbers of people, maybe up to 40 or 50 people, representing different segments of visitors to talk to them about their relationship with the venue. So a lot of research went into this. What we found was that for Essence, this diffused brand was fine. As I said, Essence don't need marketing to. They are confident, independent, art savvy, overrepresented in the Globe's audience, but the brand for them was working, so there was no problem here with this audience. For Stimulation, however, Stimulation was a divided audience. So for Stimulation attenders, they loved the Shakespeare's Globe experience. They really appreciated it as a radical experiment. For those of you that have been, you'll know the experience. For those of you that haven't, because it's a recreated theatre, they have a pit where people stand. You're very close to the stage, as well as seating, and it's an outdoor theatre, so you are covered up but not in the pit. And you're extremely close to the action. They describe it as being ultra live. You know, you really do feel part of it, and like so often the actors will run into the crowd and around the venue, so it's an extremely live and interactive experience. So attenders already love this. It's a radical experiment, they understand that, and that's why they go. For non-attenders, however, there was a misconception. They were the ones who thought it was just a heritage attraction. You know, it's going to be a very staid type of presentation, old-fashioned, English, in inverted commas, experience. So they didn't understand what the Globe was actually offering. Oh, sorry. So different strategies, brand strategies for these different core segments. So for Essence, it's simply a job of keeping them engaged, keeping them informed about the programme. But for Stimulation, particularly the non-attenders, we had to challenge those preconceptions and draw them in. So the Globe came up with a very bold new brand model. We worked with an organisation called Super Union. Well, they were called the Partners then, they're now called Super Union, who developed a really interesting new visual identity. What this model was doing, though, is looking at all different aspects of the organisation, so the performance offer, curiosity and learning, the spaces, and then encouraging Shakespeare for all. They're the four broad tenets of the brand DNA of the organisation. And again, coming up with different strategies for the organisation. So for Essence and Stimulation, the message was, we are brave, ambitious explorers. Our theatres are unique, they inspire and challenge. We are rigorous and radical. So, you know, very different messages for these two audiences, because these were the target audiences for the venue. And this model is now informing a whole common internal language. So for the first time, the departments across the organisation are using a shared language. They're thinking right at the beginning of programme planning, when they're thinking about the season 2-3 years ahead that they'll be working on. They're using the segments to inform the programming and how they're going to communicate them and how the whole offer is going to work for the audience. So they're using it to write funding applications, to determine the whole visitor experience. So it's this shared framework which is being provided for them. It's a very bold new visual identity. This might look like a simple piece of wood with a red ring around it. The Globe was built from oak, which was as old as the theatre would have, you know, from the original time that the theatre was first built. And this is one of the last remaining pieces of that wood. So this piece of wood is the same age as the original Shakespeare's Globe would have been. So very important, and the technicians who had to create this brand had to work very carefully on it to make sure they didn't make any mistakes. So the new visual identity was identified by this cause of being a holistic organisation. That's what the circle represents, but underpinned by culture segments. So because of all this work, I mean, we would say that Shakespeare's Globe is now a really good example of a cause-led organisation. So the whole organisation is working towards a single cause, but very definitely audience-focused organisation. So a very bold new visual identity for the organisation, showing that it's a kind of radical experiment, not part of the heritage industry. Previously, much of the marketing, you would have just seen pictures of the building, so it looks like a heritage attraction, whereas this is actually focusing on the work itself. Just more examples of how the identity is playing out. So really refocusing how people might look at the organisation, combined with very bold new programming, making more kind of contemporary links and showing its relevance to the present day. So an example of culture segments and how you can use it to inform your brand. I then want to talk about programming a bit more. We've already mentioned that earlier. So the BBC proms, for us, culture segments should not be seen, I think I've already made this message, as a marketing thing. For many audience engagement strategies, there's a disconnect. If you just use it for marketing, the strategies may fail because there's a disconnect between the production, what people see, and the message they get about it. You know, if we just talk about our programs differently, then it's not going to work. The BBC proms are held every summer, classical music concerts and events held at the Royal Albert Hall. This is probably one of the main things that people know about the proms, which is the last night of the proms, which is a very kind of flag-waving, huge celebration at the end of them. But they do a really interesting range of programmes around that. And one of the things they've been developing is this programme called a programme for proms at night, using a very more contemporary approach aimed at the stimulation segment. What they're describing this as is expect everything from pagan gospel and disco punk to feminist rap or DIY indie. So it was designed to be more contemporary, more politically charged, and with a slightly later start time, so typically starting at kind of 10:15 in the evening. As a result of this programming, they were attracting 31% of the audience with stimulation compared to 19% for the rest of the programme. So you can see how programme decisions are helping them broaden their audience. This is one example of that programme. So the Aurora Orchestra performing Shostakovich's Ninth Symphony from memory. I think many of us would like to try and do that. They had a presenter called Tom Service. Nicholas Collon was the conductor. They took it apart through the whole kind of rehearsal process. They took it apart, really looking at its construction, and then put it together again as a complete performance from memory. So this was actually presented as less of a concert and more of a musical type of event. So it really appealed to the stimulation audience, who not only like new experiences and experimental things, but they also like the kind of social experience. So it was really promoted as a kind of event type experience. And again, the same figures, so 31% stimulation attended this programme. I'll just show you a short video. So as you can see, design... designed to appeal to the stimulation segment, active, experimental, social, and really seeing behind the scenes. So, you know, for some audiences want to come into a venue and not see any of the behind the scenes. They want the lights to dim and the performance or the music to start and them to feel the magic as if it's it's appeared there by magic. Other segments we know, like the stimulation segment, want to really feel they've got underneath what's happening, to be part of the experience, part of the experiment. So part of what was happening there was creating that experience for people, saying you're part of it, to feel the thrill of actually getting to the point of getting it on stage. So what was the impact? Well, in the subsequent year, so they started this programming, and then in the subsequent year they carried on the programming, and you can see the results in their audience figures. So essence, so the expression, the yellow box plus 5%, affirmation, the ready box plus 5%, and then stimulation plus 6%. So that was the change in between the 2 years of the audience. So they found this audience through this type of programming and its associated promotion, and then were able to retain it. So the next thing we want to talk about is differentiating your communications. So while this might seem obvious, it's extraordinary to us how many organisations still don't differentiate their communications. It's one message for everybody, which I think, as we've already explained, when you look at the segments, that's just not going to work for people. So we need to understand the segments to create multiple routes in for people. So this is the Royal Northern College of Music in our hometown of Manchester. And they are actively using culture segments to increase engagement through their Sesjonen database. So they're using what we call tag tool, which is a way of tagging your audiences on your database so that you know which segment they are, and so that they can send the right message to the right segment. And by doing that, they're improving in their opening rates, improving the click-throughs, and then sales by sending out these different messages. It's a highly diverse program here, from orchestral music to brass bands to contemporary music to folk music, so very, very diverse segments. So tag tool I've just explained. So one of the events they used culture segments for and tag tool was Theodora. So early music is not historically an easy sell for the venue, but they were beginning to feel confident about culture segments. They'd already written the season brochure with 3 particular segments in mind, and they wanted to use this for direct marketing now, so using the database. And they believed that Handel's Theodora would appeal to all 3 of their priority segments, but for a range of different reasons. So this is how they differentiated their messaging. So for the Essence audience, who I've already mentioned don't like to feel marketed to, but they want to be assured of the serious quality, the credentials of the production, and just give people an option to discern whether it's for them. So actually this is relatively factual. Essence just need to know it's on, and they'll work out for themselves whether it's for them. For stimulation, the second segment, stimulation are really interested in something that's quirky, so they wanted to grab attention. Opera in a library, so it was presented in a library space. Why not? So it's a kind of call to action. The email honed in on the kind of edgy modern interpretation of the opera, and also emphasised the social experience, which we know appeals to stimulation, so make a night of it. And then for the third one, expression here, they want expression are open to stories and like to feel they've been involved in a story. So a tale that speaks to our hearts and minds. And there was also a range of free events to help them get more into the story. So very clearly differentiated messages used in the subject line of the email, because we know that that's what then encourages emails to be open. Sydney Opera House have recently used something very similar to this, and the research has shown that just by getting the right subject line in the email significantly increases the chance of people opening it, reading it, and then acting on it. So what was the impact here? The email open rate increased from 35% to 50%. That's a significant achievement. They had double the click-through rate, and it's been the best-selling opera that the Royal Northern College of Music have done so far. Opera's a relatively limited part of their programme, to be fair, but by this really detailed focus on understanding the segment's motivations and getting the right message to them really worked for them. So the programming department are now taking culture segments and using it in a much more serious way across the organisation. So my final point to you, which is about measuring the impact. Of course, we can do all this work, but actually we need to know what difference it's making. There's no point just throwing out all our efforts out there. So it's about return on investment, not just necessarily financially, but in terms of helping us achieve our objectives. So we absolutely want people to measure the effect of culture segments, because we know it works, and we like having the evidence from you all that it works too. So surprisingly few organisations do this in a coherent way. So it should start at the point that we're planning our programmes. You know, what are we hoping to achieve by this programme? Many of you that work in performing venues will obviously be setting, you know, the percentage of tickets you expect to sell. But sometimes, you know, I know from my experience, I used to work for Welsh National Opera and two theatre companies. Often our percentage ticket sales were based on what we've historically sold or what we needed to make it financially viable, not who we thought the audiences were and whether they would come for a more innovative or contemporary programme versus a more populist programme. So setting our objectives, which might also be about broadening an audience or deepening the engagement with an art form, is really important. And then, you know, we urge everyone to measure the impact of that. So one of the projects we've been working with the Western Australian museums for a number of years now, but this was a particular project with the Art Gallery of Western Australia. Western Australian museums, of which the Art Gallery is one, are in the middle of undergoing a $428 million Australian dollars refurbishment. Many of us would like to have those budgets to spend on our refurbishments, but they are doing some very interesting work with it. So they have a really interesting collection. Interesting hearing Mel talk about diversity this morning, because they have a really strong collection of 20th century Australian and British paintings and sculpture, partly a legacy of its kind of colonial history. But they also have preeminent holdings of Western Australian Indigenous and non-Indigenous art. So they wanted to make the most of those collections. So the overall programme is called Renew. I'll put these all up at the same time. The overall programme is called Renew, and it had these 4 broad strands. So the first one is a redisplay of those collections, really based on storytelling and the weaving of different stories, so that people could follow the stories. You know, it's no longer a very traditional just stand in front of a selection of artworks, but being able to follow different narratives through the collections. The second one, which is very interesting, is Culture Juice here, which is their contemporary culture strand, because they wanted to sort of broaden out their work and their connections with their audiences and with their populations. So examples of the kind of programmes they've been doing here is one called Sneakerheads, which is a celebration of sneaker culture. That was the first time that it had been displayed in Australia, so it had been displayed in the United States before then. I'll come back onto that in a moment. They have a really significant focus on their Indigenous art, and then also investment in social spaces, because many of the segments, not all, but many of them, for many of them, the social experience is very important to them. And we know from wider tourism and leisure research that people increasingly want experiences, and so the social matters as much as the art in many instances. So there are 3 segments that for development were essence, expression and stimulation, because they offered the most potential for them to increase their audience and deepen engagement with audiences. So as I've said, Essence, who are really interested in the content of the art, they wanted to make the most of their Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander collection, and a focus on country in Australia, which is an Aboriginal word that people use to describe the land and places to which they have traditional ties. It's a very important concept. So their redisplay is taking the concept of country and helping both indigenous peoples, but people who don't have that heritage, work their way through the collection and have a connection with this population. So it gave the regular Essence audience a real reason to return and to see new things. It also appealed to expression, who like stories and to hear stories. Sneaker culture I've mentioned, so exploring the complex social history and cultural significance of footwear, now worn by billions of people. So part of the renewing is to have very high profile contemporary exhibitions, or exhibitions that have social relevance, to encourage people to come back. So as I said, this was brought in from the United States and the only place it was exhibited in Australia. And then finally, these new methods of interpretation that they're trying. So they're the first organisation in the world to use Aggie the robot as a gallery guide. I think mixed success here so far. Aggie was the name given as to represent Agwa Art Gallery of Western Australia. Designed to drive new fun, you know, a bit of a gimmick really, because actually Aggie has to have a handler, and Aggie isn't designed to work on her own, so you don't follow Aggie around the venue, but she has a handler and then interacts with the existing visitor guide, so asks questions and just makes it a bit fun. I think the jury's out on how successful this is really going to be, but it's an example of trying something new and thinking about different ways to appeal to different audiences. So finally, just thinking about impact, many of our organisations, and some of you I'm sure will do this, but have ongoing rolling programmes of visitor research. We call ours Visitor 360 because it's designed to look at the whole audience in terms of their engagement with the art and with the venue, and to help track the impact of your interventions and to drive continuous improvement. Tag tool, which you can use with databases, also does the same thing, but our plea is that, you know, all our kind of work in audience development, we should be able to measure the impact of it, whether that's in terms of numbers of people, more people, people being more deeply engaged, a wider diversity of people. So we should set ourselves ambitious objectives and then measure them. This has very definitely attracted a broader audience. Eventually. So the expression audience, as you can see here, has gone from around 92,000 to over 100,000 visitors because of these initiatives that they've been doing, and particularly attracting this audience, making those personal connections, and very particularly the emphasis on storytelling, which is what one of the things that the expression segment is interested in. Essence, the core art purist, that's remained level, so it hasn't either increased that audience or detracted from it, and you know, that's to be expected really, because Essence, as I said, you know, they are self-motivated, they're inner-driven, they will come or not as they like it, they're able to work their way through the programme and through your messaging, so it's fine for them. But a slight drop in what we might call the more traditional audiences. So perspective, who are a segment I haven't really talked about yet. This is the green. The green one here. A drop off in the slightly more traditional audience. Perspective have limited cultural repertoire. They're more interested in doing other things. Culture isn't a driver for their life or a passion for them. And they have little appetite for change or trying new things. So this audience has actually dropped off. And while that's not ideal for the Art Gallery of Western Australia, it does reflect their brand ambition, which is actually to appeal to a wider group of people, to be more lively, more interactive, more focused on storytelling. So, you know, this is back to thinking about growth. Maybe some people can please all the different segments in different ways, but they haven't been able to do this with this slightly more traditional segment. So back to just making that point again about the variety of ways in which you can use culture segments, and I hope some of these examples have shown you, particularly in driving programme, the visitor experience, the kind of events around a programme. it's very useful for. And then finally, you know, we're here a lot, and Joss particularly is spending a lot of time here. So if any of you would just like to hear a bit more, and we can tie it in with one of our visits here, we're very happy to come and just do a session. Much of, this isn't a sales pitch, but much of Culture Segments is free to use. You know, we have a relationship with Audiences Norway, who have already shared much of this information. Much of this information is on our website, so there's a level at which you can just access this, and we know many organisations are, that doesn't actually need to involve us. But if you do want to become a bit more interactive about it, or you know, have a greater depth of understanding about how you might apply it, we're very happy to come and do have an initial conversation with you about that. Okay, thank you.